So much for all the talk of a Moscow spring. Despite sporadic street protests and the stirrings of middle-class rebellion, Vladimir Putin is back in the Kremlin, and Russia's economic and political status quo remains intact. Why do liberal opponents of Putin struggle to gain traction? Well, my guest today is Grigorий Явлинский, economist, reformer, and a veteran leader of Russia's fragmented opposition. Will the liberals ever win in Russia? Grygory Явлинский, welcome to Hard Talk.
Thank you.
Vladimir Putin is back in the Kremlin. He's just announced a new cabinet which looks quite a lot like the old cabinet, except he's now the president. We still see sporadic protests, but has anything really changed at all in Russia?
Yes, but if Vladimir Putin is in Kremlin, this is a main sign that nothing changed. So it's the same policies we have the last 12 years.
I suppose the question is whether there is something important about the scale of the protest that we saw beginning in December after the very much disputed Duma elections. Did that signify something different about the opposition?
It signifies different, not so much for opposition, but it shows that there are a lot of people who are dissatisfied with the policies of Vladimir Putin and the current government and authorities. This people is not a part of political movement. This is a kind of preparation for the civil movement. It's not a civil even movement itself yet, but it's young people, a lot of young people. It's groups of people who represent a middle class. And it's also a lot of people who can hardly define their place in the Putin's Russia. They have no confidence in their own future.
Let me ask this as politely as I can. Do you believe that the young people, the protesters that you've just talked about, are involved in a movement which is leaving you behind?
Not all of them, because when they would structure it politically, they would join different parts of opposition. It's a mistake in the West to understand that we have an opposition and we have Putin. We have a lot of different groups in opposition. There is a leftist, communists, fascists, nationalists, Democrats, criminal opposition, oligarchic opposition, and whatever, liberal opposition, many different groups. And these young people also would be fragmented by these groups.
But I'm very struck, for example, by the rise of Alexei Navalny. Now, he, as I understand it, used to be a part of your Yabloko liberal opposition movement, but he was expelled, or he left 3 or 4 years ago. But yes, he now seems to be doing things which you have failed to do. For example, using social networks and using the anti-corruption message to reach out to a much wider audience than you've frankly ever managed to reach.
Alexei Navalny was a member of my party, and he was expelled 5 years ago for nationalism.
Let me stop you there. What do you mean he was expelled for nationalism?
He openly expressed nationalistic ideas, that Russian nationality must have priority in Russia, that the others should respect Russians in a different way. He was one of organizers of the Russian rallies. He's speaking about that openly and clearly. That is his political view. And my view and the view of my colleagues is that nationalism in whatever form is extremely dangerous for such a country like Russia.
So if I can put it this way, you in the liberal establishment feel that people like Navalny, who have popular appeal, are in some senses dangerously extreme.
I'm saying that nationalists for Russia, as in Yugoslavia a decade ago or 2 decades ago, are very dangerous, and we don't share that kind of views. Another story that in internet, in virtual space, in online space, he is rather popular, very popular. He is a clever person, and he achieved a lot in that area, but that doesn't mean.
It just seems to me in your answers, you're talking about the need to focus on traditional politics, traditional party politics, when maybe Russia needs something else right now.
Yeah.
You know, when you look at Navalny and his Rospil anti-corruption website, when you look at, for example, the female punk rock band who are currently under arrest because of their protest stunts in the middle of Moscow, you look at that sort of protest idea, and it seems to have moved on from your version of Russian politics.
No, listen, I'm not speaking about my version of Russian politics. I'm speaking about the politics. In politics, it's very important not only what we are doing today and against what we are fighting, more important, or at least not less important, is what we are going to do after you would come to Kremlin. So the positive program, the alternative, is extremely politically important. And the people you are talking about, they are right young people, but they're expressing their disagreement with the current situation today.
Yeah, but they're also expressing, I think, an exhaustion with your view of politics. You said recently, I think in response to the protests of December and even early this year, you said, do they really think, talking of the protesters, you said, do they really think they can achieve something through head-on collisions and civil war? The opposition, you said, needs to focus on serious politics, winning elections and taking power, and yet this is the view of a man who has consistently fought elections, whose party gets 3% of the national vote, and who didn't actually even manage to get on the list to be a presidential candidate.
That is true. But these people were not prepared even to achieve that. And if they would continue the same line, they would be out of politics forever. So I'm inviting them into the politics, and I am, of course, ready to adjust my politics and that kind of a serious politics, what you are talking about, to their views, and we are ready and we are interested very much to modernize our approach to politics. But once again, what they are doing at the moment, it is not politics at all. It is in the interest of the current group of Mr. Putin, because he is interested that the population in Russia and youth in Russia would be completely depoliticized.
But the flip side, the other argument is that you have helped Putin over the years by continuing with your traditional mainstream party politics, fighting Duma elections, trying to fight presidential elections. You basically legitimize a system in which you can never win.
Yes, I don't know whatever never ever. That's a question which is open. I have no examples in Russia that somebody won the elections. Maybe once it happened with Mr. Yeltsin in the very beginning of the 90s. Since that time, it's a very special procedure. But I'm not talking just now about that. I'm saying that it's absolutely necessary if we want to avoid the revolution. I'm against the kind of things which would improve or implement violence in Russia. It's a very important point for me.
How close to real instability is Russia today, do you believe?
Russia is in the position that in 2 weeks, situation can change very seriously into the opposite situation. So it's an illusion that Russian politics is stable. Russian politics is stable for a moment, but not for tomorrow, and for the day after tomorrow.
But what would be the spark? You know, because an outsider looks at Russia today. Of course, there are disputes about the way in which elections are handled, but we see Putin, who still commands roughly 50% of the vote. We see security forces which seem entirely loyal to the system. You say within a couple of weeks things could change, but what on earth would be the spark that could light that fire?
That nobody knows. When you would have information about that or vision about that, please give me a call. Nobody knows that. That's Russia. Nobody could expect in 1985, for example, that in 5 years Soviet Union would disappear simply. Nobody could expect in the beginning of the century, when Russia joined the First World War, that in 2 years Russian Tsar and Russian Empire would simply collapse. Nobody could expect that. So Russia is not institutionalized politically country. That's why it can happen very quickly in a very short period of time.
Well, in that context, let's talk about the economy a little bit. You're an economist of long standing, and you've written recently about the state of capitalism, if we can call it that, in Russia. You call it peripheral capitalism because it is, in your view, so weak and so much sort of lacking the capitalist spirit that we saw in the West for so long. Is it your contention that the economy in Russia is so weak that it could undermine Putin's grip on power?
It's one of the possibilities. There is a lot of money in Russia because on prices on oil and other raw materials. It's absolutely clear. But from the point of view of modern economy, in terms of private property rights, which doesn't exist in Russia, in terms of competition, which doesn't really exist in Russia, in terms of diversified economy, it doesn't exist in Russia. From all these points of view, it's a very weak system.
And yet, only a few weeks ago, I had sitting in the HARDtalk chair one of Russia's richest men, Oleg Deripaska, and he was pointing out to me the vast potential that the Russian economy still has. Resource potential, which he says is untapped, a vast potential to the east, looking at Russia's ability to export to China and Asia. He says, yes, there are systemic problems, yes, there's corruption, but understand just how real the potential of our economy is.
Okay, we are several hundred years are living with the potential. I'm fed enough with the potential. I want to have the real market economy effective today, not in the potential for the future generations. Like this Mr. saying, we were living during the communist times. They were saying that we have a very big potential to create the communism. You know the outcome.
Yeah, but Mr. Явлинский, you are the guy who wrote the 500-day program of reform in, what, 1990 to change Russia from being communist to capitalist, and everybody associates the era that came after that with a total economic nightmare. And
yes.
The rise of the exploitative oligarchs.
Yes, because 500 days, that program was not realized, but was realized Washington Consensus instead of that. That's why the mainstream of the world economy, which I would name pain stream for Russia, came to Russia and created oligarchic, semi-criminal economy because of rough and systemic mistakes in the logic of reform.
But you can make that argument. The problem is, going back to politics, the Russian people, frankly, don't buy it. They associate people like you, that is, the radical, liberal economic reformers, with economic chaos. And they look at Putin, they look at the fact that even now he's delivering 4% growth a year, unemployment which is actually lower than that of the UK and the United States. And they say, yes, we know it's not great, we know it's corrupt, but we've got order, we've got stability, and those are things that we never had when the real neoliberals were in control.
Two things. First, you're right. This is one of our problems, that we are all, although I was, as you know, strongly against the Yeltsin's policies and strongly against that type of reform which we had in Russia. Nevertheless, because I was a market reformer, because I was a supporter of integration of Russia in Europe and in the world, because I was a supporter of private property and competition and, as you put it, capitalist economy, they put all these people together with no difference. Who was doing what? This is absolutely true, and this is a big problem.
And you've never been able to escape from that?
Yes, but you know, that was a real difficulty to separate from that, but I'm just speaking about different thing. You are not right saying that the people today are saying that that kind of stability which Mr. Putin implemented is okay. It was okay after the decade of Yeltsin. That was true. Now it's a different story. Now the people are saying that it's almost enough. It's too long, 12 years, the same thing. It's too long for them. So the main policy of Mr. Putin is not to allow alternative to appear. And the problem with the 90s is that what is we today calling the liberal economists of that period of time, in fact, were not. They were not the liberal economists. They were very close to be in, I would put it in that way, the people who are saying that goals justify the means.
So how does one go about changing the Russian economy now? If we think about the message that has been sent to Russians with the fate of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, for example, if we think about what happened to the lawyer Sergei Magnitsky, who was trying to uncover the vast reservoir at corruption, it seems, that he found in the financial affairs of the Russian government. If one thinks about the fate of these particular individuals, who is going to stand up for the rule of law, for an independent judiciary, for the sort of property rights that you are always talking about?
You are right once again. From the side of the business, these people would not do that. They are afraid. They're coming to you and telling you stories about potential. That's why the politicians, like my friend and me, we have not so high standing, because to make politics without business is a rather difficult exercise. You can imagine. Try to do it in Britain with no support of business. And the business is really afraid. This is a strategy of Mr. Putin.
And going back to Khodorkovsky, is it true that Khodorkovsky was funneling money to your political movement?
Yes, of course.
So at that time, you believed that you could make common cause with big business, oligarchs like him, and change the course of Russia. It just seems to me the message is somewhat mixed there. You don't like the oligarchic system. You don't like the fact that in Russia, men like Khodorkovsky could amass fortunes worth many billions, and yet you were happy to take his money, and you say that could have changed politics.
I'll tell you one secret. Life is always mixed. And politics is also mixed. I was absolutely sure that the vital interest of all entrepreneurs in Russia, all business people, is to have real private property rights, freedom and law. That is my program. Very simple, very clear, and very difficult to implement. And Mr. Khodorkovsky, I absolutely sure, is also interested in that. And I disagree with him as with a representative of oligarchic circles, of course. But in the future, you have the same vital interest as all other people in Russia.
You talk about fear. Is there a great deal of fear in Russia today?
Among the people who have property, of course.
I just want to ask you one very personal thing. I have read, and you tell me if it's true or not, that in the 1990s, when you were becoming more and more outspoken as a figure in the opposition, you experienced the most extraordinary, fearful moment when, I believe, your stepson was taken hostage by forces we know not who they were, and he had his fingers cut off and sent to you. Is that true?
Yes, it is true. It was true. But I'm never using these arguments in my political life.
Why?
It's not the argument. The argument is your program, your belief, your principles, and your character. This is the arguments. And many Russian people had a lot of very difficult things in their life. Because that was the period of time when the war started in Russia. Maybe what you read about my family and my son was a little bit journalistically just arranged. Not every word which you put here is just was close to the reality, but the substance was that which you said it. But I'm absolutely sure of that for the real politicians, this is not the way of making your popularity, telling terrible stories about your life.
Well, I suppose the reason I ask you about it is because you paint a picture of Russia potentially very unstable and potentially full of conflict in the future. Do you believe that the sort of thing you experienced in the 1990s, the sort of intimidation, could happen again, and that Russia remains a society where violence is close to the edge?
I'm afraid that it is possible. In Russia, almost everything is possible. Not like in America, but in the opposite thing, but it is possible.
I'm interested you say not like America, because in a way it brings me, toward the end of this interview, back to a big thought about you and your position. You've written recently a lot about the state of capitalism, and I think it's fair to say that as a man who represents to many Russians the argument for Western-style liberal capitalism, you have a problem in that capitalism in the West itself is looking deeply unhealthy.
All right.
Isn't that a profound problem for you to go back to Russia and make the case for a system which is apparently very ill in the West?
Right. It's one of my key problems in Russia, because when I'm trying to say that I want to create the same system like in Europe, which is true, I have the answer from my voters, which is saying, "How crazy?" Look at them. When I'm saying that I want to have human rights in Russia, they're saying, look at Iraq, look at Guantanamo, look at Abu Ghraib, look at Afghanistan, look at everyday news which are saying all the same. Look at these prisons in Europe, CIA prisons and things like that. The problem for Russia, one of the problems, you were talking about the problems of Russian opposition. You were correct, but I'm saying one more problem, that we have no example. Hundreds of years, the West is trying to create workable, effective system. Now, we are in a position that we can't say, look at them, let us do the same.
Well, it strikes me that you are described by so many as the most pro-Western of Russian politicians. Do you believe the West has let you down?
No, it's our country, it's my country, it's our country, we are doing best for our country. We don't need a favor. But what we really were and are interested, that you must be successful.
Yeah, I didn't really mean let you down in the sense that maybe you expected more from Obama or from the EU. No. I meant in terms of a role model, of giving a model to Russia of what they could be.
Yes, but the problem is that you are doing that not because you want to fail. You're failing because you have problems. And your problems are very, very serious and deep. Simply, Russian case is a kind of extreme example of the problems now you have. I can demonstrate you one by one that we have the same problems that you have, but the scale of our problem is much larger. So, and that is really for us is the obstacle, because the beginning of a new Russia started with the argument that we can live in the same way like Europeans and Americans. And now the people, you are talking to them, they're saying we don't want it.
Well, Grigorий Явлинский, it's a fascinating way to end this edition of Hard Talk. Thanks very much for joining me. Thank you.